James Farr here, live from Pasadena Media Studios. Get ready for more piercing and provocative. The Conversation Live starts now. And welcome to another episode of The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. Today we're going to unpack and have a very critical conversation. My guest today, and we'll give you a little bit more about her background in just a second, but we're going to talk a little bit about updating AB 392, as well as something that she has coined and trademarked, Contempt to Cop. Let's meet Cheryl in this package, and then we'll unpack her story on the other side of it.
If I kill you, there's only one version, and that's the one that I give. Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Ezell Ford, John Crawford, Tamir Rice, Sam DuBose. We see this happen time and time again, even in front of a jury. Typically, what an officer says is taken as truth. I wanted to push back the narrative that was being put forth by police chiefs about why officers are using deadly force, because in my mind, they were using deadly force as a first resort and not as a last resort. I did have an impression of the LAPD growing up, and it wasn't a good one. I had many family members and friends who had negative encounters, and so I grew up kind of not liking the police.
And welcome back. Cheryl, thank you so much. How you doing today, sis?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
You know what I'm excited about? Because, a lot of times I'm doing this as stuffy, and you just have such a presence, and you're very outspoken, and you speak your truth. And I want to learn a little bit more about that, but kind of the first thing that comes to mind, how does someone who you just said you grew up not liking the police, how you end up spending 20 years as a sergeant?
So here's the deal. I needed a good job with benefits. I found myself very young, having just gone through a divorce with a small child and a lot of debt. And I was working for Department of Justice, and I had the opportunity, because PCP was a big deal. I was working for Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement agents, and I had an opportunity to participate in a sting operation. And so when I did the sting operation, and I know what the DOJ agents were making, I was like, I need to be doing this, right? And so my mindset was to join any law enforcement organization that I could get on for a year, get post-certified, and then lateral back to DOJ. LAPD was under a consent decree, and they expedited the hiring process. I went through the system, got hired, got an academy date, and then once I got on the LAPD, I realized that you could do 20 years and retire on a service pension for the rest of your life. And so I was very young, and I thought, well, I'm just going to hunker down on LAPD and stay here, and then I'll figure out what I want to do with the second half of my life. And so that's how it happened.
And through that, you saw some things, because we're going to get to Black and Blue a little bit later on. I mean, you were exposed to a whole lot, and you did something that I think the public feels not enough has been done. Like, you actually kind of have blown the whistle and shared some of your experiences about culture, but when you think about your decision to become a whistleblower and kind of expose some of the things that you were exposed to, and that's, some of these things are in the book, right?
Correct.
Okay. I mean, did you ever have any trepidation about your decision? I mean, in hindsight, because you're out there now.
Yeah, no, so you know what? I didn't know what I was doing when I started it, but I knew it was going to be provocative, and I knew that everything that I had gone through on the LAPD was purposeful. I went through all of what I went through, good and bad, so that I could speak credibly and undeniably about the things that I found out that were occurring, started to occur in 2014. And so I wrote my book, Black and Blue. The Creation of a Manifesto was my first volume, based on the whole Christopher Dorner incident. And I wanted people to know how he got there. So let me be clear, I don't condone murder. But I understood how he got there, and I understood how any job can wind you down and grind you down and make you do things that are out of character. I wanted people to know how he got there, and more importantly, I wanted other police officers who were similarly situated to know, if you find yourself burdened and overwhelmed, there are policies and procedures. You don't get to go on a killing spree. And so that was the nexus for me writing my book, and then it just morphed into what it is that I do now.
Okay, because I know we've seen you on CNN with Anderson Cooper. I mean, you were featured in Finding Justice, the docuseries on BET, Walking While Black, the documentary, and Dr. Phil as well. I mean, a host of cable shows, and you're well sought off after Talking Head, and now you can add The Conversation Live to your list as well. But I mean, have you been threatened? Because I mean, like, you're so high profile, you know, and have spoke such truth. Have you ever felt threatened for your life or your safety?
Well, listen, I knew that, you know, this was going to be controversial, and I knew that not everybody was going to agree with what I say, and I get it from both sides. I get it from activists who are sometimes bothered by what I say, and I get it from law enforcement who don't always agree with me. But listen, the LAPD prepared me well, and so I'm not thin-skinned, and I understood that I was going to be speaking my truth, and what I wanted others to understand as I did that is that their agreement is not required. And so I say what I say unapologetically.
Okay, let me check in. You're watching The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. My guest today is Cheryl Dorsey. She's a retired LAPD sergeant. She's also an author, and she is a media personality, and she speaks a lot about issues in police culture, police accountability, and quite frankly, she has kind of gone against what I'm sure many of her former co-workers would agree with. I want to talk about this update with AB 392. You know, it's moving through the legislation. Let's check in real quick, catch the audience up, Hannah, and then we'll talk to Cheryl on the other side of this.
You know, I've coined a term, contempt of cop, that I like to use when I talk about officers who punish people for not following an order. And I hear all the time, you know, well, people need to comply. Yes, they do, but guess what? It's not unusual for someone who's broken the law to not want to go to jail. For someone who knows they have a traffic warrant and you stop them for a traffic-related offense to get out the car and run. That's not uncommon. It's inherent to what we do. And so when that happens, you don't get to just shoot them in the back.
And welcome back. Yeah, got a little ahead of ourselves, so we'll go ahead and talk about that, and then we'll bring up the other segment, or next one. You talk about contempt of cops, so we'll fix that in post. Officers kind of get pissed off. Explain what contempt of cop means.
So contempt of cop is a term that I trademarked because what I know to be true is that if you piss an officer off, there's a price to pay, right? And that price could be something as simple as a traffic ticket. It could be as inconvenient as me arresting you on a Friday and putting you in jail for something that I know the DA is going to reject because I don't have sufficient cause to prove that, right? Or it could be, in the case of Eric Garner, death, or Mike Brown, death, or Sandra Bland. She pissed Brian Encinia off, death. And so what I want people to understand is know those red flags when you're about to piss one off and hopefully save a life.
I mean, because officers come into the situation with the authority, with the arresting powers, with a gun. I mean, is this just like a systemic part of their culture that they are the man, and I'll use that in both genders, right? Is that what's going on? I mean, why does it show up with such hostility and anger and contentment towards people, especially people of color?
I think it's the difference between men and women. I think as a female officer, I'll speak for me, I understand my limitations, right? And so I know that there's not a man I can whip, right? And so I understand that there's sometimes things that I'm going to have to do to try to de-escalate and diffuse a contentious situation, and I don't take it personal. I'm not sure that guys have that gene, something about testosterone that flows through them. And so when someone does something that they take as an affront, then they want to one-up you, and it becomes very physical. That's how it manifests itself.
I mean, but contemporarily, we're hearing a lot about emotional intelligence. So if it's something that you're saying may not be innate in the male species, is it something that officers can learn? Or is it something that you have your younger officers that may still be in that warrior phase of their life? You know, if they weren't on duty, they would be at a bar brawling, because that's what you do at 28, 30. You're feeling yourself. Can it be trained out of them? And
You know, listen, I think it's innate. I think that's what male officers do. I know, having worked around them and seen them off duty and heard stories, because I was married to one, about what they do after work, right? Because I know mine wasn't coming home right after work. He was out engaged in activity, much like the kind of thing that we see them engaged in on duty. And so I think, it's innate, and I think it's learned, because listen, a probationary officer is like a child. Our TOs hold our life in their hand, and we want to be pleasing. We want to get off probation. We want to get vested. On the LAPD, probation is 12 months after a 6-month academy. And so when you're working with somebody and they get a little testy with someone, or they get a little aggressive, me too, because I want to be pleasing to my training officer. He writes my ratings, right? Mm-hmm. And then I go on and I replicate that when I become a training officer, and this is the pattern and practice that I show to my impressionable young mind, if you will, if the person is not strong enough to fight that.
Okay, so we're talking about contempt of cops. So, one of the questions I asked, I facilitated a training with about 50 officers just last week over near the beach. And, so during a traffic stop, the officers are going to typically ask 3, but really 5 questions, right? License, registration, insurance. But it's like the next 2 questions, and we want to frame this up like as a trigger, right? I'm just a square dude riding in a car. I ain't did nothing. I don't have anything. But overwhelmingly, people of color seem to be asked, are they on parole or probation? Do officers not understand that that's a trigger? Like you're accusing me of being a criminal, or you're criminalizing what I'm doing. How does that show up? Or what is that the officer really wants to know at that point?
I don't know that they recognize it as a trigger. And again, I think this is something that's learned, right? You watch your training officer approach people, and you hear him as the passenger officer on the passenger side of the car asking that question. And so you just repeat what you have heard, and you don't really recognize. And maybe when it's pointed out to you, you don't really appreciate it. The other thing that people always are asking Black folks, and particularly Black men, that's off-putting is, where you going?
Yeah.
Where you coming from?
Right.
And our response is, I'm a grown man. Mm-hmm. I'm going where I'm going, or I'm coming from where I'm coming from. What do you mean, where am I going? And so those kinds of things, can maybe be untaught, but if the officer who's asking those questions doesn't realize how off-putting and how insensitive it is and how offensive it is, don't buy into it, right? And continue to replicate that, then you have us responding in kind. For me, when you look at the Sandra Bland incident, at the very end, it was a done deal when Bryant Encinian went back to her car with the traffic ticket. All she had to do was sign. It was over. And he says to her, you seem like you kind of mad.
Right.
And she says, you're damn right.
I mean, as if people have contact with the police on a traffic stop and are happy. I mean, I just don't get, how is that lost in what they're doing when they're serving the public? It's you talk about this toxic male masculinity, and that can permeate over into women as well, testosterone and adrenaline and whatnot. But the need to control, the need to curb people, for example.
Because most times, in my opinion, it's not about compliance. It's not about getting control over a person. It's about punishment. Mm-hmm. And so when you fall victim to contempt of cop, well, then there's a price to pay. And so now I'm going to punish you. And it just depends on how you respond to the punishment at the onset, how crazy that punishment becomes. Because we saw Bryant Encinian say to her, put the cigarette out. Mm-hmm. I believe the reason he wanted her to put that cigarette out is because he had already formulated in his mind he was going to put hands on her. And he needed her to not have a lit object in her hand when he did that.
How did you balance when you were on the force? Because you did patrol, you did crash. I mean, you worked in the different sections of LA. So you've seen a little bit of it all, cross-section.
And so for me, it was very easy because, first of all, I'm a mother. And, I'm a mother of 4 young Black boys, men now. And my mindset was always, I'm going to treat everyone I deal with the way I would want any officer to deal with my sons should they get stopped. Mm-hmm. So I was never any question about what to do. You do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, right? And I didn't take it personal. I didn't take it personal. I get that you're mad about this ticket. It's going to cost you some money. I get that you're bothered that I'm going to take you to jail. You did that thing. I don't take it personal. And so I think a lot of times officers get personally invested when someone is profane, when someone runs. That's what people do.
Right.
It's inherent to police work. So when somebody runs from me, I know I've got two choices. Get ready to get some exercise or let them go.
Is it possible, or did you come to a space where you realized, but law enforcement does not process the contact that they have with the public as a trigger, but from a reptilian brain standpoint, that fight, flight, or freeze? Like, I'm in trouble. I don't want nothing to do with this trouble. I may have done something. I may have done nothing. I may have just had a little bit of weed in my pocket, when cannabis was illegal. But the tall tale of it is it's next to nothing. Does law enforcement see it that way, or you think it's coming around to that?
I don't think that they really see it that way. And I think part of the reason that they don't see it is because there's no accountability, right? As a training officer, as a supervisor, we have teachable moments for our subordinates. And so part of that teaching sometimes is negative discipline. And if there's no accountability when you shoot somebody because they run, if there's no accountability because you choke somebody to death because they don't turn around to be handcuffed, what have they learned? What have you done as a police chief, as a police department, to deter bad behavior when there's no accountability for bad behavior? In essence, you're teaching your officers that was a good thing. The next time somebody runs, I need you to chase them, and when you can't catch them, I need you to shoot them in the back 8 times, like Michael Schlager did with Walter Scott.
Why don't more officers, because we often hear from retired officers, right? They'll say, that those that are comfortable and willing to share what their experience was when they were on the force. But why don't people come forward? I mean, it's like the police are asking citizens, tell us who did the shooting, tell us who did the crime. We want to know, we want to help, we want to better enforce and protect the community. But people don't see that that's happening on the other side. Why is that?
It's the culture. It's the snitches get stitches, right? On the police department, there's a price to pay if you speak truthfully. If police chiefs wanted the good officers to report the errant officers that I talk about, it's a real simple fix. All the police chiefs have to do is create a safe space where officers are not going to be retaliated against, where they're not going to be given what we call freeway therapy, which is transferred to a division far from where you live. I reported a commanding officer who sexually harassed me, and I went to the safe place to report it, which was 2 miles from my division of assignment. Before I could drive 2 miles back to my division, my captain already knew. There was no safe place. There is no such thing as whistleblower protection. And so why would an officer jeopardize a nice Monday through Friday job with weekends off, or a desirable, coveted assignment, when they know that they don't have the support of management, a supervisor, a lieutenant watch commander, a captain, and ultimately your police chief?
I mean, is it that chiefs of police are more empathetic to the line officers, the ground pounders, and less likely to administer some sort of discipline? And I'm saying outside of what the union, or what they can do per the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. Are they more empathetic because they may have been that officer?
Well, listen, every police chief was once a police officer,
Sure.
Be clear. But I think ultimately when you get to that place where you breathe that special air that police chiefs breathe, and they too answer to no one, their job is to that entity, to that organism. Their job is to protect the department. And if an officer gets the homie hookup in the process, okay, but it's really not about the officer. It's about that civil suit that's coming, because they know it's coming, right? And so they do what they can to minimize and mitigate that bad behavior as best they can, when they can. And every now and then they'll make an example, like we saw in the case of Laquan McDonald when Jason Van Dyke was found guilty, like we saw in the case of Muhammad Noor very recently, who shot and killed a woman unjustifiably, like we saw in the case of Sam DuBose, Michael Schlager. I mean, I could name a list of officers who have either been fired, given the gift of resignation, or actually been convicted, but that's not I believe, a police chief's knee-jerk reaction. Protect the organism, circle the wagons, minimize and mitigate that behavior, and then let's just see where the chips fall.
Let me check in. You're watching The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. My guest today is Cheryl Dorsey. She's a retired sergeant with LAPD. She's also an author, and her book is out right now. It is Black and Blue, The Creation of a Social Advocate. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the updates. I think we should have this clip right. Hannah, can we go ahead and roll in this clip, and then we'll talk about what's going on with AB 392.
Okay, if you haven't heard, a major bill to change the rules around police use of force in California just made a big step forward. It's called AB 392, and today it passed its first committee in the Assembly, but not without big crowds and a pretty emotional discussion. So what does the bill say and what's next? Let's connect the dots. Ever since the police shooting of Stephon Clark in Sacramento last year, there's been calls on both sides of the aisle for reform when it comes to police use of force. Some people think police should have more restrictions for when they can use it. Others say changes should come in the form of more training. It's a contentious topic and one that, as we mentioned, brought hundreds of people to the Capitol today because of AB 392, which was up for its very first vote.
People came from all over California to address this issue. Many of them working class individuals taking off from work to come to help you to understand their pain and their concern about what is happening in California.
So what does this bill say? Well, in gist, it would change the law so that police can use deadly force only when necessary versus when it's reasonable. That could make it easier to prosecute officers involved in deadly shootings.
And welcome back, Cheryl. Thanks so much. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I wanted to make sure that we got an update on AB 392 and kind of understanding that there was a little bit of a compromise. You know, activists have one opinion, police have one opinion, you know, families have another. But what we should point out that's different and in this compromise is the language of necessary versus reasonable. Just from a layman standpoint, what are we looking at in terms of a difference there in that space?
So what it does is it requires officers to take a step back, determine whether or not there's an opportunity to de-escalate the use of force, which has really always been there, but officers don't do it. And now when you don't de-escalate, if you have an opportunity to do that, if you don't use deadly force as a last resort, which is what we're taught and trained, rather than a first resort, then there's a consequence to be had. And so this gives officers an opportunity to do that. And listen, I know the pushback is from unions and the California Police Chiefs Association is that that's unreasonable to ask an officer to make a snap judgment decision about when to use force. But we do it every day. Everything we do requires us to make a decision very quickly. If I pull you over to issue you a citation, I got to go through a checklist. I got to decide when I'm going to turn on my lights. I got to decide when I get on the radio and let dispatch know. I got to figure out where I'm going to pull you over, how I'm going to position my car so that when I get out, I'm safe. If I get you out, you're safe. All of those things can be done in a nanosecond. And that's why we receive an inordinate amount of training so that when we are in a situation, we just do what we train. We don't have to think about it. And that should be the same thing that we do when you pull a trigger. You should not pull a trigger on someone, point your gun at someone if you're not intending to use it because you want to intimidate somebody, because you want to scare them, or because you want to get their attention. That's not what we're required and trained to do. And so AB 392 is going to give officers an opportunity and mandate that they use other less lethal options before they jump to firing their weapon.
But you know, it has been said on the other side, families don't want it. You know, police chiefs don't want it. The California Police Chiefs Association president is against it. Is it going to make officers less safe?
No, it won't make officers less safe. That's just ingenuous and intellectually dishonest to say that. If you have to think about what you do as part of your training, isn't that what we want? Doesn't every occupation, doesn't a pilot have to think when he's in the cockpit? You know, if stuff is going sideways, he got to hurry up. He don't have time to go to a manual. He needs to know what to do and do it. And so police officers are required to do the same thing. It's intellectually dishonest to say that it makes police officers less safe. And listen, while families may not want it, it's a good first step. It's a great foundation, and we need to build on that. Now that we've got officers being required to use other options before they get to deadly force, when they do, we need to hold them accountable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, because I know here locally, our police chief talked about use of force being down. So he seemed a little indifferent to the legislation, and I think that may have something to do. We don't control whether it's passed or not. It's just going to be what it's going to be. But why is it not? You call it circling the wagons in that company speak, right? The FAA only reports planes that crash. You never hear anything about safe landings, right? And thousands happen all around the world all the time. Why is it that they tend to go to try to lean into that narrative that we're not as forceful as we used to be? In fact, force is down, and can't focus in on the 1%, the one incident?
Well, I think because that's part of the company speak. That's the double talk that they do. And, I have people ask me from time to time about, statistics, because what I know as a police officer and a police supervisor, they can be manipulated. And you can point to that at any given time. If you move, a crime from one category to another, and guess what? All of a sudden, something just went down. But the fact of the matter is, if you really want to bear a gauge for what is occurring, ask the people that are most affected by it. Ask the people who've lost loved ones, ask people who are victims of crime if rates are down, if gang violence is different, if police uses of force are going down. One loss of life unnecessarily is one too many, particularly when officers had the opportunity to freeze frame, because most of what we do is there are no urgent circumstances, there is no exigent circumstance. Most of what we do, we have the opportunity to freeze frame. Stephon Clark, officers chased him into grandmother's backyard and he's around the corner, according to reports. Freeze frame, you got the benefit of an air unit overhead. Get responding units to come. There was no urgency to deal with him right now.
Last question. Do you think they had a bias? Did they see him as a threat because he was a person of color?
I can't get in their head. I can't say. But again, what I will say is that if they understood that there was going to be some accountability, maybe they would have thought twice. If they knew that their police chief wasn't going to circle the wagons and minimize and mitigate that shooting like they have, maybe they would have thought twice. And so maybe now with a couple of officers going to prison like Jason Van Dyke and Michael Schlager and Roy Oliver, maybe officers are going to start to realize that I could be the next Roy Oliver who's sentenced to 20 years for taking a life when it was not necessary.
All right, we're going to park it right there. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining me. You're watching The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. My guest today is Cheryl Dorsey, 20-year veteran, retired at Los Angeles Police Department as a sergeant. She has a new book that's out right now, so make sure you go look at it. It's Black and Blue, The Creation of a Social Advocate. This is our last show this season. We will be on a short hiatus. We'll be back in the third week of July with more piercing and provocative conversation, and look forward to seeing Cheryl here again in the seat as well. And as always, until we have another opportunity to speak with you, agape. The Conversation Live is brought to you by